Okay, good morning and welcome. This is a breakout session on the resilience agenda, as if to suggest that maybe it's possible there is but a single agenda. Okay, probably not. The title was chosen, Healthy Ferment in the Field, or Are We Caught in the Chinese Finger Puzzle? And for those of you who know the resilience field well, I'm sure you've experienced, potentially contributed to, a little bit of pull that's natural as communities of practice emerge, as policies get framed on the basis of hopefully good practices, and people are beginning to try and determine what does resilience mean for them in regard to where they are personally, professionally. Resilience as a concept has been around for a long time. A lot of different communities have worked with it. And it seems like there is a couple of common denominators. One is that resilience is a positive adaptation in the face of adversity, any type of adversity. And there's general consensus that resilience is a process. I would suggest that the development community is not yet able to construct a theory of change, to use a term of art, if you will, around resilience. We're trying to understand what it means intellectually, operationally, from a policy and programming perspective. And this is where the ferment comes in. How can we wrestle with these ideas? How can we wrestle for primacy in terms of policy and funding priorities in a more healthy way? How can we learn from one another, whether you are on the food security side, the DRR side, whether you're working in the context of a fragile state, dealing with resiliency in the aftermath of conflict, trying to help people in terms of climate change impact, or working with communities that are struggling to become resilient in the face of violent extremism, terrorist groups. When we think about this, the unit of analysis can be the individual, the family, the community, cultural groups. All are appropriate entry points, and what we do in terms of our resilience agenda very much depends on how we define who we're working with and why. Some considerations that I'd like you to keep in mind as we get into the discussion and as the panelists present are things along the lines of, is resilience about the bounce back after a stress or a shock? Is it more about the ability to mitigate the impact of a future stress? Is it preventive in nature? Can we construct a framework that allows for all of these to be viable components of a resilience agenda? What's the timeline we operate in? Immediate response in the face of a crisis? Short term, medium term, longer term? And we've done a lot of this type of timeline thinking in terms of conflict and mainstreaming conflict prevention and conflict resolution and transformation into the development agenda. Perhaps we can begin to think along those same lines in terms of resilience. What are we measuring? How are we measuring? Why are we measuring? Who measures? It's critical that we measure, that we report, that we analyze, that we learn, that we adapt. As Carrie in the opening statement was saying, impact proof points. That's what she's looking for in terms of the MasterCard work. Well, how do we develop impact proof points around resilience? One of the things that Greg had said, Greg Collins with USAID, whom Jill will introduce shortly, coming back from Addis, is that the community needs to accept that we're there. And now let's focus on developing best practices and moving forward operationally. So how do we do that? Hopefully from an evidence-based perspective. The panel this morning was chosen to try and get at these issues through different vantage points. We had hoped that we would look at it from a policy standpoint, both on the private sector side and the public sector side, that we'd look at it through a major donor, USAID, and their resilience policy, from a European implementing organization, and a US policy and implementing NGO. One of the panelists that was intended, Colonel Stropes from the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense, who works on humanitarian assistance in DRR, is not able to join us, but we had hoped that he would have provided that perspective as well, talking a little bit about why it's important for the military, how they lash up in the interagency process, and how they work particularly closely with and at the direction of USAID to provide additional assistance in these kinds of considerations. Before I turn it over to my colleague, let's think about a few things in a nested sort of way. How do we understand and measure resilience deficits and strengths inherent to preventive, adaptive, and recovery capacities? What's similar, what's different? How do we transition from a state of instability and vulnerability to something more stable? I'm not sure what that is. What specific indicators do we need to identify, skills, tools, coping strategies, in respect to the different scenarios: disaster response, climate change, food security, conflict, state fragility? Again, how will these be similar and how will they differ? How do contextual factors such as chronic vulnerability, a fragile state, a collapsed state, a war-torn or conflict communities affect our efforts? And how, and perhaps this is most important, do we identify, leverage, and build on indigenous assets and practices, regardless of whether we're working at the level of individuals, families, communities, cultural groups? How do we do this as part and parcel of the resilient solution set? At this point, I'd like to turn this over to my colleague Jill, who is a co-chair along with me. My name is Louis Rasmussen. I'm with Tetra Tech, and Jill is with JBS International, and she will be moderating. When we are through with the panel, I'll stand up and play Phil Donahue for those of you who are old enough to remember Phil, and try and bring microphones around to you.
I want to welcome everybody. Today we have three panelists. We'll start off with Jay Randall Tiff, who has been a senior policy advisor in the World Vision U.S. International Programs Group for close to a decade. Next, Greg Collins will speak. He is the Deputy Director and Technical Lead of the USAID Cross-Bureau Resilience Secretariat and a Food Security Advisor in the agency's Bureau of Food Security. And finally, we will have Adrian Enright speak. He serves as the Global Coordinator of the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Program for the international NGO known as SNV, the Netherlands Development Organization, and is their project manager of a climate-smart agriculture project working across Cambodia, Nepal, Bhutan, and Laos.
Thank you. So just a few years ago, the concept of resilience was a fairly technical term in use within narrow discussions around psychology or ecology. And it broke out in a big way in the development community, not only here in Washington, but in London and Rome and in other global capitals in the last couple of years. And many groups in our community can lay claim, or do lay claim, to the resilience agenda, as Lewis mentioned, the disaster risk reduction community, the climate change community, food security, and even those who look at conflict mitigation as a primary focus within our community. So is resilience an enlarged concept of risk reduction? In recent times, the emergency capacity building project, Save the Children, DFID, and others have issued policy documents that have largely made resilience and disaster risk reduction, or DRR, synonymous. So we have to ask the question whether there is something larger in the idea of resilience. And I would say one answer is that disaster risk reduction activities are not, at the community level, they're not always common cultural practices that relate to DRR. They're not necessarily going to be an uptake on, for example, storage techniques. When you look at how behavior change works, and the health community has helped a lot in this area, you realize that there may not always be something natural in terms of communities adopting risk reduction activities. So that's kind of an opening jeopardy, but let me give you, as I was asked to do, kind of a brief scene setter on the resilience agenda. One might trace it back to the post-Asian tsunami of 2005, when the humanitarian community recognized the need to more effectively anticipate and measure shocks and stressors, and put a risk lens on recovery and development. In the food security crises of 2008, 2009, we realized we hadn't really applied the risk lens effectively. Resilience seemed to be down. Resilience was up again in Haiti, as Haiti was devastated by the earthquake, and the mantra was build back better. And again, there was an effort to look at risk. Haiti faded, but then again, in the droughts that hit the Horn in 2011, and the food security crises in the Sahel in the same period, we've seen the emergence of a resilience agenda that seems to be sticking. So let's look at what some in our community have done in developing the resilience agenda, responding to the Sahel and Horn crises. Within a year of the most recent crises, donors took up serious thought leadership. There was a Champions of Resilience group formed by the principals of USAID, Dr. Shaw, DFID, UNDP, and that group did some serious planning and coordination around resilience. We have also seen, since within a year, I would say, of the Horn and Sahel crisis, we saw the release of USAID's policy and program guidance on building resilience to recurrent crises, and I know Greg will talk about this. But this strategy basically said that the broader community has to address recurring or chronic cycles of food crisis and hunger. And USAID offered the definition that resilience means the ability of people, households, communities, countries, and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. That became kind of a marker for a lot of us, but just to give you a sense of the breadth and the buy-in that was emerging in the donor community, one more example, the OECD established an experts group on risk and resilience. That group has become quite active and has actually been as responsible as any actor in the field for kind of wrapping around these core food security and livelihoods challenges, a body of work that relates to conflict, fragility, governance, and systems analysis, and how all of that supports a kind of resilience lens and a way of measuring. So in the humanitarian and development partner community, those of you gathered here, most of us are from a partner organization. I think we started to recognize the need for a coherent framework for multi-sectoral assistance that was increasingly linked to governance and conflict and at different levels of host country leadership. So World Vision is a private NGO, delivers a lot of private development assistance. Quite often, official development assistance isn't even in play in some of the programs and countries where we're forwarding a resilience approach. We are doing a lot of work right now on safety nets and system reform. The NGO resilience agenda also grew out of our experience in the Sahel, and that's been a kind of riveting experience when you have 18 million people facing starvation or food insecurity at the height of a lean season. And so it was, again, the same set of drivers. And I would say our conclusions are similar to the donors. A resilience approach could reduce reliance on humanitarian assistance by improving people's capacity to adapt to inevitable shocks and stresses, and ultimately decrease, and this is what USAID has put forward as a target for itself, to decrease the number of humanitarian interventions or people requiring humanitarian assistance over time. So one conclusion, if resilience is merely a lead-in for a better understanding of how all this relates, these different program interventions, as well as applications of social capital, social cohesion, how communities find internal synergies to provide safety nets for the most vulnerable, I think it will have been success enough. It is sometimes rocket science to try and get multiple interventions working together in the right ways. But I think there is actually more to the resilience agenda, and I think hopefully from some of you and from those of us up here, we're going to hear a few ideas about how we are starting to measure the right things. I want to mention, too, that there is one good example where we are trying to create synergy is the formation of something called the Resilience Learning Consortium. World Vision, Mercy Corps, CARE, and Catholic Relief Services have formed this consortium with the objective of creating an evidence base to understanding resilience. In partnership with Cornell and other research institutions, we are looking to achieve, through the fact that we're all operational agencies with a wide spread and scale in some countries, we're seeking kind of a multiplier effect in knowledge sharing. And so the Resilience Learning Consortium was one of those groups that participated in the conference last week in Addis, the Vision 2020 conference, which IFPRI organized, a number of us co-sponsored. And I think that marks another milestone in a resilience agenda that is likely to stick. Let me give you one more. And this is something that hasn't been, where there isn't as much analysis, but USAID is again in the lead. Local systems thinking is gaining ground and kind of shaking hands with the resilience agenda. It's helping us to envision locally led adaptations and community system reforms that could serve as models for enabling national system reforms and taking resilience to scale. And I think I would commend to you the just released policy, Local Systems, a framework for supporting sustained development, as part of what we're talking about here with resilience. So let me just, in a couple minutes, highlight one program area. I was asked to give you kind of a sweep of how the resilience agenda has come to where it is today, but I also, as the NGO representative on the panel, want to give you one good example of a resilience program and how it connects. We have an innovative agricultural program, which many of you may have adopted too, Farmer-Managed Natural Regeneration. So it's an agroforestry initiative. It gives farmers very simple pruning and harvesting techniques to encourage native tree growth. And at the farm level, FMNR can rapidly restore the health of soil, improve soil fertility, allowing farmers to leave crop residue on the soil, providing fodder for livestock. Where we have done this, it has been a remarkable, it's allowed recovery in places like Niger and Ethiopia. It's also become a catalyst for increasing incomes, where we have applied this in Humbo in Ethiopia, the first large-scale reforestation project, which is registered under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have produced nearly 100,000 carbon credits and that have paid back to the community almost $1 million in income. So what we are seeing is, in many countries, this approach is reversing desertification and biodiversity loss. It's increasing incomes and food production and decreasing reliance on external aid. So we have World Vision as an organization is applying resilience programming, a resilience program approach to a number of contexts, and the types of practices that we would say resilience encompasses would include community-based disaster risk management, early warning, early action, climate change adaptation mitigation, like I've just mentioned, the FM&R practice, or fuel-efficient stoves, resilient livelihoods. So forming very well-established practice of forming smallholder producer groups and enabling their ability to access markets, to form savings groups, to adopt risk crop insurance and reduce risk in that way. But we're also looking beyond, we're experiencing resilience in even a broader way when we look at comprehensive school safety, we look at urban resilience, and there's a rural-urban continuum we're looking at, local advocacy, and the crucial role of communities empowered to collective action, to identify service delivery gaps, and to basically demand or work collaboratively with local government to improve services. We see local capacity and the building up of capacity of local government is very much part of the resilience agenda. So an example of how these are coming together: in Tanzania, we provide assistance to smallholder farmer groups to organize, negotiate, and gain bargaining power. We are seeing that it's not only about increasing incomes, but we are seeing greater reliance on drought and flood-resistant crops, better weather forecasting, greater adoption, again, of risk insurance. So I think, we are bullish on the resilience agenda. We see it as something that is kind of worthy of a robust defense in the face of a tendency to do business as usual or budget pressures among donors. And so I think one of the contributions we're trying to make here is in promoting a healthy resilience agenda dialogue. And we have convened with the Resilience Learning Consortium, USAID, Wilson Center has been a partner. We have convened a couple of roundtables in the last few months that have been kind of a catalyst for a number of us to collect our learnings. And I think we're looking forward, this being kind of another step on that journey, we're looking forward to continuing to be part of that dialogue. So thank you, and I'll look forward to questions.
Are we going to take questions or go through?
I think why
No,
don't
we'll
we
go
go ahead and go
Okay.
through and then take questions.
Thanks, Randy. That was great. I'm very tempted, since Randy said the semi-painful USAID resilience definition, to skip it. But I actually want to make the point that this somewhat over-articulated definition actually turns out to be extraordinarily useful when we talk about how we're going to measure resilience. So I'll read it again and then come back to measurement at the end. So we define resilience as the ability of people, households, communities, countries, and systems, for example, social, economic, ecological systems, to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. So I think one thing to point out there is the focus on capacities, the capacity to mitigate, adapt to, and recover. And that suggests that we're not only going to be measuring this as a series of outcomes, but actually as a series of capacities that are realized in relation to shocks and stresses and affect certain outcomes of interest. The other thing to note with this definition, which I think is important and actually was initially a debate, is are we seeking to have people bounce back to a prior state of vulnerability, or are we seeking more than that? Are we actually asking the types of investments required be made that they actually bounce back better? Now, from a measurement perspective, it's probably worth untangling that, but from a policy perspective and from a strategy perspective, USAID is firmly in the position of promoting this bounce back better, linking this to our inclusive growth investments. So with this said, I want to point out one thing from the beginning. I mean, as Randy said, there was sort of it might have been the third impetus, but the real driving impetus that we're still riding today has to do with the 2011 drought in the Horn of Africa, the largest in 60 years, and then a follow-on in 2012 in the Sahel. And I sort of want to point to three sort of rationales or impetus that grew out of that. One is very clearly a humanitarian impetus or rationale linked to lives, livelihoods, dignity, aspiration, and those social, psychological factors actually become a very important part of this equation. The second is a developmental rationale. If we look at drought in Kenya between 2008 and 2011, it's estimated that it cost the Kenyan economy over $12 billion. Now, that's not to say that we wouldn't expect future droughts to have some impact on the economy, but it is to say that unfettered drought can be mitigated and that developmental impact can be reduced. And then finally, the very, very poignant economic rationale. Does anyone in the room know how much the US government spent in responding to the humanitarian crisis in the Horn of Africa in 2011? Someone guess. 1 billion. 6 billion, maybe even more motivating, but 1 billion. But actually, if you go back in time, we've spent more than 6 billion. If you go back and look at the cost of recurrent drought every few years, back 20, 30 years. Fast forward to the Sahel in early 2012, another 500 million spent in humanitarian assistance. And I think it's very important to make the point that where the drought in the Horn was the largest and broadest in 60 years, the drought in the Sahel in 2012 was actually a minor shock. But it only makes the case more compelling because what it says is, even in the face of minor shocks and stresses, people are at a state of vulnerability that they experience that, the impact of that is actually substantially large. And I think it's useful to think of drought as an exposing moment. People are often asking, resilience to what? I think it's too simplistic to say resilience to drought. Some of the things that Randy pointed out, when we looked at the dynamics of change in the Horn and then again in the Sahel over the last 30 years, we see a number of underlying factors: population pressure, climate change and vulnerability, the shift to market economies where people become more vulnerable to price shocks, particularly around food. So where drought might be that moment where we see this vulnerability, it's in fact a vulnerability that's very diverse in nature. So in terms of what's different, people often say, well, our development investments are building resilience, and it's true, and I think it's actually useful to take as a starting point the reality that all good development and a good chunk of what's done under recovery and rehabilitation contributes to resilience. But what's different about what's emerged post-2011 in the Horn and in 2012 in the Sahel is really this renewed developmental focus on people and places that we've dismissed as a humanitarian crisis or a humanitarian risk. For USAID, I think a case that really points this out is Kenya, where we had our Feed the Future investments in a certain part of the country, partially in the semi-arid lands, but really looking at people who were vulnerable but viable. And the Northern Arid Lands was a place where we really responded every few years with large-scale humanitarian assistance programs. And in fact, those programs have become so consistent that it was difficult to tell where one drought ended and the next one began. So one thing that's fundamentally different about what we're doing is bringing development perspectives and development resources to those people and places and development best practices. I think another major feature of what's different is a much more explicit recognition that these shocks and stresses aren't anomalies. Now, it sounds funny to say that for those who've worked in the Horn of the Sahel and experienced this every few years, but it was as though we were treating these as anomalies and responding with emergency humanitarian programs. So what does that translate to in terms of programs? It means in addition to developmental investments to facilitate inclusive growth, that we're explicitly trying to reduce and manage risk and build adaptive capacity. And build adaptive capacity not only to climate change, but to other factors that are intersecting and creating vulnerability. And then finally, the third feature of what's really different about our efforts is the extent to which we've combined humanitarian development assistance, perspectives, to jointly address this problem. So again, if we look at northern Kenya, we've got a very large humanitarian footprint. In the absence of development investments, these actors, such as WFP, some of our NGO partners, have begun bleeding into the development space, even through humanitarian assistance funding. So we see things like asset creation programs, the DRR programs that Randy's talking about, and now building on that as a foundation, we're seeking to make development investments that build on them explicitly in the same communities and amongst the same people. I think another feature is the recognition that we will experience another drought. And so that humanitarian response, where we're making these development investments, actually has to be embedded in our resilience strategy so that we respond in a more timely manner and in a more appropriate manner. So instead of responding late with the general food distribution, we are, for example, responding early with commercial livestock to protect development and resilience gains. I've talked a little bit about the jointness of our humanitarian and development programs, but one thing some of you may be familiar with was this formation of something we call joint planning cells. Sounds a little devious, not that devious, but it was a means of us looking internally within USAID and forcing our humanitarian and development folks to sit down, jointly define a problem, jointly unpack it, and then jointly make investments and commitments and plan against that strategy. And I think some fundamental features that came out of that type of analysis. One, the heterogeneity of pathways. If we look at northern Kenya or the Sahel, it's not just about livestock and crops. We have some people who are moving up and commercializing on those sort of on-farm livelihoods. We have other people that are stepping out, meaning they're keeping a foot in on-farm livelihoods, but they're recognizing the need to step out. And then we have some people, either by choice or strategy or force, are moving out completely. And I think that recognition of these multiple pathways is important. Second, by looking back 30 years and looking at the dynamics of change, and this again plays up something Randy said, it really became clear that the starting point for this is looking at adaptations that are already underway. One example, in fact, is farmer-managed natural regeneration. If you look back 30 years, this was actually initiated through Food for Work, Food for Asset programs by NGOs and other actors on a small scale, occasionally over the next 30 years, complemented by additional investments, but it really took off organically to the point where the U.S. Geological Service looked back over the last 60 years and now recognizes that over 5 million hectares in Niger have been regreened over the last 30 years through farmer-managed natural regeneration. But I think this whole notion of looking at, I think Lewis called it indigenous practice, I'm calling it adaptations underway. From that standpoint, we begin to look at things very differently. And another key example is migration and remittances. Whereas there's tended to be a tendency to look at migration as something that's negative, something that should be disincentivized. If you look at the dynamics in the Sahel, or if you look at Nepal, where remittances make up 25% of GDP, you recognize that this is an adaptation. Yes, we need to mitigate social consequences, but in fact, it is an area where we can invest for more successful outcomes. So really understanding how people are establishing this degree of livelihood independence. It used to be about livelihood diversity. How many different livelihoods are people engaged in? Some of the research from Mercy Corps in Somalia, some of the household economies research going on in the Sahel actually suggests it's not the count of how many livelihood sources you're engaged in, it's the degree of independence, meaning if you're engaged in on-farm activities, do you also have a foot in something that's not rainfall dependent? And I think that's an important thing to look at. The other key thing that came out and was actually stressed in the AUDIS meeting is the role of social capital. And I think we need to move beyond simply recognizing the role of social capital and social networks to actually asking ourselves, how do we invest in building and strengthening this key condition that we know is central to the resilience of households and communities, whether they're in the Horn, whether they're in New Orleans, New Jersey, et cetera. And in that line, I think another thing that came out of the AUDIS meeting that was interesting was looking at, we sort of recognized that resilience deficits or chronic vulnerability are both a technical problem in the sense that we can address it through technical interventions, but an adaptive problem. Investing in social capital, part of an adaptive solution. Investing in critical thinking skills, part of an adaptive solution. But our sort of prescriptions and investments have tended to focus on the technical. And I think that's a little bit of a bounded rationality. It's what we're comfortable with. And I think we need to begin to push ourselves to really ask, okay, beyond these technical interventions, what are the true sources of resilience in these households and communities, and how can we build that? Okay, perhaps during questions, have a chance to talk a little bit more about our flagship efforts in the Horn and Sahel. The Horn focusing on Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, and the Sahel, our initial focus on Niger, Burkina Faso. Just to briefly touch on it, they sort of center around 3 pillars. One, expanding economic opportunities, both the core on-farm livelihoods and off-farm, as I just spoke to. Second, strengthening governance, but using that term very broadly to include natural resource management, conflict management, disaster risk management, and the interplay of formal and informal structures. And then third, investments to enhance human capital, health, nutrition, WASH, and as I just mentioned, other adaptive capacities. Women's empowerment actually coming out very clearly, both in the analysis in places like Somalia and in the Sahel, but even intuitively when you begin to unpack this very intertwined set of problems, women's empowerment comes out strongly as a key human capital. Just briefly, I've been asked to wrap up, but I did want to touch on measurement, as I mentioned at the outset. Again, we do have some top-line outcome indicators that we've identified within USAID. One is reduction of humanitarian assistance needs during a drought of 2011 magnitude in the Horn or 2012 in the Sahel. We normalize this by looking at a set of normalization variables such as the NDVI, a vegetation index, but I want to be very clear that that indicator is hugely problematic because the way that humanitarian assistance figures are determined is not entirely consistent either over time or over space. But it is important because it speaks to our economic rationale for these investments. Other top-line measures include depth of poverty, and for those familiar with Feed the Future, that's a contextual complement to poverty prevalence, recognizing that the communities we're working with are well below the poverty line, and we want to see movement below. Second, a moderate and severe household hunger, and third, wasting, or global acute malnutrition. And again, for those of you familiar with the dryland areas of the Horn and the Sahel, this is a distinct nutritional feature of these areas, wasting or thinness. So we look at stunting, but we're really interested in wasting as well. Those are the outcomes we're interested in, but as I said at the outset, the big movement in resilience measurement, and I think the advances over the last year, have been really looking at, okay, we're interested in those outcomes, another donor may be interested in another set, but how are we actually measuring the capacities that mitigate against shocks and stresses and result in these outcomes? So there's been a real focus on measuring these sets of capacities, and doing so not only at the individual and household level, but at the community level, at the systems level. I think the systems level right now is pretty murky, but just this idea that we're focusing in on those capacities, I think, is important. And I think I'll end it there.
Thank you. Adrian? Sure, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm about 2 inches from falling off the stage over there, so I thought my own resilience measure might be to stand up. I hope you don't mind. Firstly, thank you very much to the organisers of the event, SID, for the opportunity to present. I wanted to try and bring in some of the arguments and points that have been made already, and then introduce some of the work that SNV, the Netherlands Development Organisation, is doing as a sort of practical approach of how we see resilience. So firstly, I think Lewis sort of touched on the point of resilience being something defined by who we're working with and why, and those sort of contextual arguments, which I think applies for our case. There was also the point made by Randy about local systems and then feeding that up and leading into national, integrating that idea of resilience into national systems. We also just heard about whether does resilience mean bouncing back or bouncing back better, and certainly the approach that we take at S&V is certainly in line with USAID. It's about not only reducing that risk and allowing people to go back to where they were, but also opening up opportunities to go beyond that and in a much more resilient way. So firstly, S&V, the Netherlands Development Organisation, we're an international non-for-profit working across 38 countries with 2,000 clients. We are funded by a suite of different donors. One of our most important donors is being USAID, and hence we have an office here in DC. And really our focus at S&V is to look at market-based solutions to pro-poor development. We work in three principal sectors: water, sanitation and hygiene, agriculture and renewable energy. And it's within that agriculture program that we have a lot of activities around climate smart agriculture, which is where we try and bring in that our adaptation and resilience picture. So going on to the point about that Lewis made originally about resilience being defined by who you're working with and why, in terms of our interpretation of the resilience agenda, we very much see resilience embedded in the work that we are doing within the agricultural space. As we all know, 60 or 70% of the food that we eat comes from smallholder farmers, and therefore those smallholder farmers are also the same body of people often bearing the large majority of risk from climate change. Therefore, we see embedding that idea of resilience into our agricultural programs as being one of the most important ways that we can have impact. In saying that, we sort of we look at resilience in three different ways and target three different areas of resilience. Firstly, capacity building and general awareness raising around the climate change risks at that local level is obviously a key pillar of that. The second is more around income diversification and also income protection. So income protection, sort of talking about tools such as micro-based, weather-based insurance for crop damage and so on, as a way to build income security that leads to a much more resilient community or resilient landscape, as we can say. The third component there would be food, and I would also add nutrition security, and shoring up that particular agenda within the local context as a means of ensuring resilience. Across those three broad spectrums, of course, there's, I think this was also touched upon just briefly about the role of gender in that. We all know that women often bear the brunt of unfairly of climate change risks, and therefore gender must be a key component within any sort of interventions at that local level. And as we feed up, it's a very key cross-cutting sector within any sort of intervention. So that's sort of the approach and the definition of how we look at resilience, and by no means is that a perfect or widespread interpretation, but it's just to throw it on the table and say that this is what we're doing, and I guess now I wanted to introduce some practical implementations of that and also some challenges that we're experiencing. How we sort of put those broad ideas into practice. As I mentioned, we take those three principal areas that we work across and combine that with our mandate of introducing market-based solutions for poverty reduction. And it's probably best illustrated through at a project level. For example, we are currently working with around 2,000 smallholder shrimp producers in southern Vietnam. The major driver of deforestation there being the clearance of mangroves, which obviously has a huge impact for local communities in terms of the risks that they're facing under climate change scenarios due to sea level rise, storm surges, siltation, and really that flows on to impacting on the productivity of surrounding lands. So really the approach there has been to focus our resilience measures on improving income stability. Obviously, under future climate change scenarios, the livelihood aspect of those, the livelihoods of those particular people are going to be continuously threatened. Therefore, we've introduced a link between smallholder farmers and the private sector, a major exporter of shrimp in the country. Have worked with Natureland certifying body to be able to introduce best management practices alongside of mangrove rehabilitation. So at the same time as securing farmers with a more secure price over time from that particular buyer, and therefore achieving resilience in the form of that income stability, you also introduce a greater resilience in terms of the natural resilience that's introduced through the mangrove restoration. So that sort of goes to the point, I think, a little bit of the farmer managed rehabilitation that was brought on earlier, with a bit more of a market angle to it as well. So that gives you, I guess, a bit of a brief picture of how we look at the resilience picture, and a bit of an example of on the ground of what we do. A key important, and I want to take this point from Randy, is that a key challenge for us is trying to integrate those local level solutions up into subnational and national level of planning. That's clearly one of the best ways that we see as introducing those sort of impacts at scale, which we heard about earlier, but also introducing that idea of resilience not only at the local level but subnational and national level. Alongside of that, I think there's a major advantage of also taking upon a couple of points made before about Indigenous knowledge. Often the solutions or interventions at that local level are carrying through that Indigenous knowledge, and if that can be embedded within broader policy and planning processes, then that's a much better stream to be able to carry that knowledge working forward. I don't have time at the moment to illustrate that, but certainly that's the case that we're finding in Surkhet province in Nepal, where we're reintroducing a lot of the Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous experience in crops. Another example of that would come from micro-based insurance programs in Vietnam, where we've been very successful in introducing, again, taking that income security angle of the resilience picture, working with smallholder rice producers to insure them up to 90% of crop damage from weather-related events or pests and diseases, and then integrate that into subnational planning processes. In saying that, there's obviously always challenges with taking that sort of approach, and I think Lewis talked at the start of maybe contexts where you have previously had conflict, so working in a post-conflict environment. And I thought I would illustrate just a couple of those challenges that our efforts to upscale those into policy and planning experiences under in a post-conflict situation. Obviously, there's a huge issue of governance, and the fact that in a post-conflict situation, you often have a very weak or lack of governance structure, but you also have a lack of trust between the people and the government sector itself. You also have, and it can't be underestimated, a lack of trust between people at that local level as well. For example, in Cambodia, in our work in Cambodia, we're often seeing that there's still ongoing land disputes left over from the Khmer Rouge, and that's having a huge impact in terms of the trust that currently exists within that local community, and therefore any sort of intervention to introduce ideas of more generally around resilience are really come up against a brick wall because of that trust. The last point that I wanted to quickly touch on, and it's something that I guess I'm here to learn more about more than speak about in particular, was the issue of measurement. In terms of just reiterating, SNV really looks at the context of resilience in terms of the impact that climate change is having on people's livelihoods, and continues to do so. So there are many variables be able to try and measure that. But really we're at the start of implementing our own set of principles and criteria to be able to measure effectively what sort of impact we have on the resilience agenda. Obviously, we come up against the barriers that you normally would in terms of trying to balance the accuracy of those measurements versus the cost, and I think that's a key challenge that any NGO or any implementing agency faces wherever those measurement criteria are being implemented from or thrust upon. We have to try and see that as a way to actually do that effectively, but also do that in a cost-effective manner. So I guess maybe a point here to raise to USAID and others in the donor community is understanding, I guess, that position that implementers are in, but also understanding that it would be nice in an ideal world to have some level of donor consistency in terms of how we are implementing that measurement, so that on one hand we don't have to apply to or comply with USAID standards in measuring it this way, and in another completely different way for another donor agency. So I'll wrap up there and just sort of, as I said, reiterate that I hope that gives a bit of a practical angle of the three key areas in which we look at the resilience agenda, particularly linked to agricultural livelihoods, and noting that some of those other more broader development agendas, such as gender and Indigenous knowledge, is we try to embed that in our thinking. I've also touched upon the importance of working with planning and the policy context, but also some of the challenges of doing that, in particular the challenges of working in a post-conflict situation and in measurement. So I will leave it with Jill. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Randy and Greg and Adrian. I'd like to open the floor up now for questions. Louis is going to lead with the microphone.
I want to thank you. It was a very informative discussion. My name is Joseph Lombardo. I'm with ICMA, the International City and County Management Association. What I'd like to focus a question on is something I didn't hear, and that is the phenomena of urbanization and how urbanization as a contextual factor plays into both your assessment of the issues of resilience as well as the decision about programmatic interventions.
You want to go ahead and take 3 questions, and then or you want to go ahead and answer?
Whatever you'd like.
Why don't we take 3 questions, and then we'll go ahead and answer those.
Thank you very much. My name is Hisham Jabi. I'm at MSI in Washington. We work with a few civil society organizations in Syria, and they focus a lot on humanitarian assistance and relief, which is very important, but when you try to discuss with them the need to really start to think beyond humanitarian assistance, their response basically is, our work is dictated by the environment, and it's very hard for us to really think beyond that. And we are actually wrestling with the donors, because the donors is really emphasizing the needs to help these organizations to think beyond humanitarian assistance. So from operationalizing the work of NGOs, what can you say to help NGOs to think beyond humanitarian assistance and start to think in a resilience-oriented mindset?
This is Eric Boyle from ICF International, and building on Hisham's question, is it helpful to think in resilience programming in terms of ROI? So X number of dollars of humanitarian assistance are saved by Y number of dollars of resilience programming, and if so, what are the complexities and challenges of that? Thanks.
Do you have any preferences?
Sure, I can actually start with the last one first. I think there's actually an excellent piece by DFID called The Value for Money, looking at not only resilience, and that one actually gets a bit fuzzy, but looking at the difference basically between typical late response, early and appropriate response, and then resilience. The reason resilience gets tricky is because what does it actually constitute? So they actually break out by a series of different interventions, and they've got some pretty compelling numbers that quantify what we all sort of think is intuitively true. That early action, that these longer term investments in addressing underlying causes actually does have a return. That's the good news. The tough news from a donor and project cycle perspective is it's not a 5-year turnaround on that investment. So one of the figures that DFID puts out is somewhere between a $2 and $2.9 return in terms of avoided aid, avoided livestock losses, and developmental benefits for every dollar spent on resilience, over a 20-year period. Because it's taking into account the cyclical nature of the shocks and stresses in our humanitarian response. So I think they've begun to quantify, and I do think it's very worth looking at that actual document to get to understand how they did it, but they've begun to quantify, so I think that that's extremely useful. And I think, you know, if I'm honest, and I did put it at the end of our three, what are the compelling rationale here? The economic rationale, when you've spent $1 billion in humanitarian assistance in responding to one drought in the Horn in 1 year, it gives you that leverage to really go back and make the case. Does that mean we only do resilience where we have spent $1 billion in humanitarian assistance? And I think that's where we're at right now within USAID. How do we actually not wait for the next disaster? And then, even more broadly, how do we look beyond these obvious cases where there are huge humanitarian outlays to look sort of the broader relevance of resilience as a concept to inform our Feed the Future portfolio, to inform, it's already informing our Food for Peace development portfolio. So I think that's part of the challenge. When you don't have that compelling, driving economic outlay, how do you get it to resonate with people?
So how do we get NGOs toward a more resilience-oriented mindset? I think one is back to systems. I think that we are, and you mentioned NGOs specifically, many NGOs are based in a context for a long period. They're making a commitment, often with private funding, to be community-based and with staying power. And I think we have a unique position to help understand systems and how they guide practitioners toward the layering and sequencing of programming for effective resilience outcomes. And I think context analysis is a crucial thing we can come together on. So we're adapting resilience programs to context. And one of the challenges is if effective programming and the integration of different interventions is so much tied to context, we have a challenge in terms of scale. But the NGO community, I think, has some unique advantage there. Understanding conflict and even doing effective conflict analysis and mitigation is another unique contribution. And I think there is we can come to a common mind on building conflict and fragility into some of our resilience models. I think there is also a risk of overthinking the conceptualization of resilience and losing sight of the ability to manage what we've developed in terms of a resilience program approach. And finally, in terms of where NGOs can come together with a resilience-oriented mindset, I think we have to think a lot more about safety nets and social protection systems. And I think finally we have to push donors for more flexibility in funding streams and longer-term time horizons, especially at the inception of projects, to have a great deal of flexibility around design. And community, of course, communities being directly involved in leading the design process.
Thank you. I'll take up Joseph's question in terms of urbanisation as being a factor. And I mean, I would agree on two fronts. Firstly, I think urbanisation is a direct factor in the resilience picture, particularly when you have a look at a lot of countries in Southeast Asia where they're growing so quickly and that really integrating that idea of resilience into planning becomes absolutely pivotal going forward, because things are moving so quickly, and as we've heard, the resilience agenda can take a lot of time to instill and to develop. There's almost an imperative to work alongside of ministries of planning and whatnot to really integrate that thinking, although it's still evolving. Integrate that thinking relatively early on, so that you get that. We can't necessarily stop urbanisation, and it's not necessarily a good thing to do that. But we can also work with those ministries to be able to integrate that thinking. I think in an indirect manner, and maybe it's a bit of an obscure angle to take, but in an indirect way, urbanisation is also having impacts on the resilience agenda in other ways. I'd take the example of we were in the field in Nepal last week, and we had a village level meetings, and the participation was great from the women, and they said, oh, where are all the men? And they said, oh, for 6 months of the year they're building India, basically. They're building new apartment blocks and whatnot in India. So the labour force is the capacity of those local farmers to adapt to climate change is severely impacted, because 6 months of the year their village is cut in half, and it's affected by the urbanisation of other countries as well. So that's a really different and really complex story. But I guess they're two examples of how urbanisation certainly is a factor in that picture.
And maybe just to pick up on that, I mean, this is a perfect example of, that doesn't necessarily mean we want to look at migration to urban centers as a negative. It's an adaptation. It's happening. It's actually happening at quite a scale in Nepal, with this figure of 25% of GDP and remittances, both from international and within borders. So that's pretty compelling. I want to just briefly comment on both Joseph and Hassan. On the urbanization, I think this has actually been, you're right to point out, has been a very weak point. And particularly as we looked in the Horn and the Sahel. Now, we've been forced to look at it by the fact that migration has come out so strongly, particularly in the Sahel, but also as we begin to look at Asia. It's a very different picture. And I think the World Bank a few years ago came out with a strategy document that said, invest in people, not places. I'd like to correct that and say invest in people and places. People move, and the people who are going to urban centers are tied to people in rural centers through reciprocal obligation networks. So we can't not invest in either. We've got to invest in the success of those who are going to urban centers, but recognize we also need to invest in rural areas, because if we don't, we're dragging down whatever success might have happened through urban migration. And I think as USAID, we've tended to focus on areas where we have significant investments to build on, and those have typically been rural areas. So it is a good point to call it out as a gap. On the humanitarian link, I think there's a couple of things. One, yes, I think it's definitely incumbent on donors, and I wanted to mention a few things. One is the sort of emergence of multi-year funding. DFID, ECHO, and USAID were on a panel together in Addis last week. All of us are doing multi-year humanitarian funding where we're addressing chronic vulnerability, even though it's manifest as an acute crisis. So I think part of it's about donor demand. Second is joint funding. A number of our programs in the Sahel, in Somalia is a good example of an Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, Food for Peace Humanitarian, and development investment co-funding of a joint program statement that's demanding of people who are responding to emergency to articulate a link to development investments, or we call it sequence layer integrate, but how they're bringing these different platforms together towards addressing chronic vulnerability. Finally, so I think we can actually demand that sort of collaboration amongst partners. And then finally, to the extent we're actually building in future humanitarian response into our development investments through things like crisis modifiers, where we actually hold a pot of money aside and allow an NGO or implementing partner to react to the crisis without undermining the development investments, it's actually going to be the new state of play. That there will still be a demand for humanitarian assistance where it happens in an unpredictable way in isolation, and I don't want to suggest otherwise. But where we're responding to humanitarian crisis every 2 to 3 years, every 4 to 5 years, we are building those responses into our development and resilience investments, so this sort of one-off type of responses won't be possible. I think it's actually been extremely useful to have national level donor dialogue. The Arid Semi-Arid Lands Donor Group in Kenya, Red FS in Ethiopia, the Nigerians Nourish Nigerians in Niger, as a means of bringing donors together to have a sort of collective statement at national level around those sorts of issues.
Why don't we go ahead and take 2 more questions?
Hi, thank you. My name is Amy Kokenauer. I'm with NCBA CLUSA. We're currently leading the resilience project in Niger and Burkina Faso. And actually, Greg, you answered the question that I was going to raise, which had to do with one of the biggest challenges we see as an organization that primarily operating on the development side is when there is a crisis, in the moment of crisis, that displacement or that distortion of the markets that we've worked really hard to set up on the ground, whether it's food markets or, Greg, you addressed that through the crisis modifier model that's built into the project. So I'm actually going to ask a different question. You mentioned earlier about measuring the local capacities at the household level, community level, and systems level. We have this, with such a huge project and so many local partners, so many different aspects, and I did want to highlight the governance piece. How important the governance piece is as well in terms of coordinating on the ground for a resilience agenda. Could you talk a little bit more, and any of the panelists can address this, but how USAID plans on measuring local capacity changes through this project, and any examples that either Randall or Adrian would like to give on that as well. Thanks.
Larry Cooley from MSI. I have a question about who in the host country governments tend to be your best interlocutors on these issues, and whether there's any consistency across countries. It's a little easier for me to see how this crosses the lines on the donor side than it is for me to see exactly how it aligns on the host country side.
I'm just going to take 2 questions.
Okay, sure. You want me to start?
So, local capacity changes, governance, and host country interlocutors. We're seeing huge potential for applying social accountability, what the World Bank and others have called or developed. It's basically local advocacy embedded in programs. And a lot of the greatest uptake has been in the health and education sectors, but we are pretty rapidly moving this model into, or tool or methodology into food security and livelihood security types of programming. One good example, in Armenia, we had a situation where communities, rural communities, remote communities were not accessing health care. It's a problem of service delivery, but it's really a problem, as we discovered, of incentives in the system. So we've found through research in a number of places that where communities are designing or identifying the problem in service delivery, where the scorecard approach is used, that the communities, the local leadership are developing what's being monitored in seeking to improve service delivery, where they're empowered and trained and equipped to engage local leadership, local government, and where you always find at various levels of local or regional governance people who want to do the right thing. You find champions. We're finding that community-driven social accountability and scorecarding, as opposed to other models where scorecard approaches or targets may be provided to the community, there's a big difference in outcomes. We're seeing, significant difference in outcomes across multiple sectors, and we are seeing the need to now take this methodology of empowering local communities to design the improved service delivery they need. In the Armenia case, we had the local government step up to the problem and change the incentive system for doctors, nurses, and other medical care providers to travel to those remote communities. And so you have now compensation based on distance of travel as well as other factors. And we've actually helped in the Armenia case to scale that up to a national level policy change. With existing law, not a constraint because it recognizes citizens' entitlement to health services. These methodologies being applied to the resilience programming, and we're showing that you always have government interlocutors who want to do the right thing and who are part of the solution. So it's one example.
Okay, maybe to take up Amy's question first. I mean, I think you're right to point out, and the fact that we're embedding future humanitarian response within our development strategies only partially solves the problem, because there's still going to be humanitarian response in the future that's untied to strategies. And so we've seen in the past in the Sahel, we've put some development investments, for example, in developing seed markets. An emergency happens and people respond with free seed, completely eroding a market. We've seen in Kenya where a humanitarian assistance program comes in untied to a development investment and actually pulls the professionals out of the market. The professionals who are building through private sector investment in an area, pulls them in, they become government or NGO employees. So it continues to be a problem, and I don't think we've fully solved it. I did want to say on measuring capacities, there's the type of institutional capacity that Randy's talking about, but we're thinking about capacities more broadly here. What is that set of capacities at individual household, community level that actually allow people to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shock? So I'll give an example of one we're using in the Horn of Africa to begin to get at this. We're including in our survey work for the baseline surveys questions like, were you able to lean on other households during the last drought? Will you be able to in the future? If so, what type of household? To get some sense of whether people are leaning on within communities, a sort of bonding social capital, whether their network reaches beyond immediate community, as bridging social capital. And we're also investing in really looking at community resilience, not as an aggregation of households, but as a unit of analysis in its own right, and really the unit at which social and natural capital are managed. So I think we've got some very interesting tools that we'll actually be testing in some of the work that Amy's organization is doing in Niger, of looking at measuring capacities at that community level. And again, it's not, the big step here is it's not just looking at outcomes, it's actually trying to get at those capacities. I think we lean very heavily on social psychology and its use of self-perception measures. Those can be critiqued, certainly, but they do actually give us an insight that's very, very useful. I think another thing I mentioned at the beginning, but I want to highlight here because it's becoming more and more prominent, aspiration and dignity. If you look at some of the statistical analysis coming out of Niger, some work that Tango did, there's an extraordinarily strong correlation between resilience capacity and measures of aspiration and dignity. And we've begun to look at what's called a GHQ-12, which is a sort of standard questionnaire on sort of social psychological health, begin to include that. And I think this is a pretty exciting area of measurement as well. Finally, I wanted to, excuse me, address Larry's question. Yes, very clearly there is a condition that exists where this is working. Kenya, Ethiopia, Niger. The NDMA, the National Drought Management Authority in Kenya, the Red FS in Ethiopia, the 3N in Niger, Nigerians nourish Nigerian, and what's common about these is that they're actually cross-ministerial bodies within government. The death knell for this is if it gets stuck in the Ministry of Ag, and we take this as an agricultural problem, or if we stick it in the Ministry of Health. So where we're seeing it work well is where we have these cross-ministerial bodies. And that's actually pretty much mirrors what we found within USAID. If we stick this within the DACA, the Humanitarian Assistance Bureau, it becomes a DACA thing. If we stick it in BFS, it becomes a BFS thing. I will tell you the biggest challenge, though, is where do you stick it? I mean, seriously, when we're looking at how do we institutionalize this, how do we make sure it lasts beyond the current wave out of the recent droughts, beyond the current administration, where do you put it? And we do not have a good answer. We know where we can't put it, but we don't have a great answer as where you put it to have it live within USAID.
Adrian, you want to provide the final?
Yeah, I'll just quickly address Amy's question again. I think a lot of good points have been raised, but I would just add, in terms of measuring local capacity, what I would say is that the problems with measurement that come later on down the track are often due to a misdiagnosis of the existing capacity right at the start. And therefore, what we really try and emphasize is working with the local communities at the start, is to really identify what are the constraints of existing capacity, whether they be uptake of technology, or it might be market information, it might be social issues that are preventing that, and really designing the interventions based around that properly at the start. And often that's not very easy to do when there's pressure to implement and to push interventions straight away. But I think really in that case, therefore, the set of measurement indicators really has to be rigid enough that they stack up against the evidence, but also flexible enough that you can adapt them to that local context. Because if they're too rigid, then you come out with results at the end of the day that aren't really reflective of the capacity that may have been built. So, in saying, yeah, I would just add that often the problem with the designing of those measurement indicators comes because of a misdiagnosis, perhaps, of the existing capacity at the start. Yeah.
Can I make one short plug? There is a group put together through the Food Security Information Network. It's a technical working group on resilience measurement. Draws people from IFPRI, from NGOs, from the UN agencies who've been working on resilience measurement. You can Google it. We've got a series of papers that have come out. The first is the Principles of Resilience Measurement that really makes, in a much more eloquent way, some of the things I've been talking about the need to focus on measuring resilience as a capacity in relation to outcomes, the need to actually measure quite specifically shocks and stresses. Anyway, it's a good resource around measurement challenges.
Sounds interesting.
Just one last thing on USAID. I think USAID deserves a lot of credit for the internal changes you have made, even without having achieved full institutionalization of resilience programming. Just the fact that you've combined funding streams from the likes of the Bureau for Food Security, Food for Peace, OFTA, and solicited programs even in multiple countries, so regional programming with blended funding streams, I think is a pretty remarkable achievement.
Yeah, just to give an example, Amy, your program is funded by the Bureau of Food Security, the Environment Bureau, Africa Bureau Water Money, Complex Crisis Funds, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, Food for Peace. Now, the challenge is how do you report on that when all these funding streams have indicators? Yeah. Yeah, so it's something we're acutely aware of, but there is a not so subtle aid reform example going on here where instead of taking a certain pot of money and saying, what does resilience look like from a food security perspective? What does it look like from a conflict perspective? Bringing all those people together, jointly defining and unpacking a problem, and then looking back at our earmarks and our initiatives and saying we need some of this, we need some of that, and packaging it in creative ways.
I want to thank everybody for coming today and our presenters.